I was working in Ledbury in service, and I decided I would like to move away, and I wanted to go to London. I was giving my notice in, and she said, well, where are you going? And I said, well, I want to find a job in London. And she said, well, I think I know someone that you could go to. So it seemed that I never had to sort of apply for a job. I didn't meet Mrs. Stern at all before I actually went there. And so anyway, we decided I was going up by train. I did have a brother and his wife living in London, so that I wasn't entirely in London without any family. I had to find my way to Montague Square. I had to have a taxi. I didn't even know where Montague Square was. Anyway, when I got there, the cook met me, and I was introduced to the rest of the staff, and of course then I had to go and see Mrs. Stern. That's the first time I'd ever met her. She seemed very nice, and so from then on I started work, and I did quite a bit of the cooking for the staff, because we were not a huge staff, but there was a butler and a footman, a chauffeur, and there was a scullery maid, kitchen maid, housemaid, under housemaid. So it was a fair-sized staff. This would be 1938. War was declared in 1939, wasn't it? That's right. So it was the year before the war. I can remember when we went to the cinema and places like that, you'd get the Pathé News, and Hitler was always there and inciting his troops, you know. And it was frightening, but you never really thought it would come to anything. The Sterns were Jewish, and it must have been those trains, the kinder trains, but we knew that these children were coming over from Germany and Austria, and that he had something to do with this, and the Rothschilds, and they obviously found places for them to live. We had the other house, Highdown, that's the one you're really interested in, and they had a skeleton staff in both places. So cook, myself, the butler, the footman, and the chauffeur, and the lady's maid, we all travelled wherever the Sterns were, we were. Sometimes we went on the train, sometimes we went by car. The chauffeur would drive us down. It seemed a long drive to me, and was there a house at the bottom? I can't remember.
2 lodge houses.
That's right, there were. And I do remember when it was dark, the glowworms were all up the driveway. I did feel that the rooms the staff were sleeping in, they weren't terribly big, and there were 3 of us. We did have separate beds, but there were 3 of us in one room up, in the top of the house there.
What about the road that's now the A259? Because today it's
Yes.
a dual carriageway.
The roads weren't that wide in those days. There was a bus route, because we could go into Worthing to the picture, so I remember that, so we could go on the bus.
What were your first impressions of Frederick Stern and Sybil Stern?
I have to say that in those days you didn't see much of them. She didn't come down to the kitchen very often. She did occasionally, but as for Sir Frederick, we never saw him, or very seldom. The cook used to go up to take orders from Mrs. Stern.
Right.
She always, and I remember the menus were always in French, which I didn't understand at that time, but you pick it up as you go along, you know. And why, I don't know. Why should they be in French? I mean, ridiculous. It is a snob thing.
And what about Mr. and Mrs. Reed?
Well, yes, I can recall them. I remember them living in the cottage. It was almost adjoining the house, as far as I can remember. They had a family. They had a daughter, and the daughter was getting married, and the cook, Mrs. Jacobs, made the wedding cake. And I'd never seen a wedding cake made before. I thought it was quite wonderful. Oh, Barnes, he was quite a character, that one. He was very nice man. But I didn't know that he was
You've been a poacher.
Been a poacher. No, I didn't. No. But of course they always dressed very smartly, and the footman used to, and I don't remember his name. I remember, of course, I suppose we called him by his Christian name, and I really can't remember. But he always wore the footman's uniform, you know, with the striped sort of waistcoat. And yeah.
What time would you start in the morning?
Quite early. I suppose you'd be up 6ish in the morning. We did breakfast, and by the time breakfast was finished, you see, then you'd be starting to get lunch, and then there'd be dinner at night. So it was quite a busy time. But you did get sort of spare time between. As I said, we used to walk up onto the what do you call it? The downs. That's right. Yes, we did.
When would your day end? How long were you working?
After dinner, and everything was washed up, I suppose. Depended on how long dinner went on and how many courses they had, I suppose, yes.
So when your sister was poorly, Mrs. Stern was quite kindly towards you at that time?
Yes, she was. She asked the cook to tell me to go in to see her. And she said, now you must go and stay in London, stay in the London house. And I had to go up by train. And she said, go out into the garden and tell them to pick you the nicest bunch of roses to take with you. And yes, she was very kind in that way. So, of course, they used to go down to Highdown for the racing at Goodwood. So that we'd have visitors, you see, for Goodwood races. They probably came for the gardens, but you see, in those days I didn't realise the gardens were so important. And we knew of his interest in the flowers and the irises, and we knew that he had this one iris named Sybil Stern. But you don't realise then how important it was.
Did you walk around the gardens?
Yes, we did, yes. It was a chalk garden, wasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, they were lovely, the gardens were lovely and kept very nicely, you know.
Oh, James. Lady Stern.
Yes.
What do you particularly remember about her personality or?
Oh yes, she was a wonderful lady. And her husband, of course, he was in with the Home Guard, because he was an officer, and of course they used to go up to Hill Barn on a Sunday to shoot. I was in the Red Cross and I was not supposed to, and I didn't realise it's supposed to shoot, but I said, oh yes, I'd love to go. So I went up there and learnt to shoot, and then was found out and told off, and so. But Mrs. Stern was a really lovely lady. She was an officer in the Red Cross.
Do you remember anything about Highdown Gardens in those days?
Oh yes, and I remember them when they changed. He went to abroad and got all these lovely flowers and brought them back and made all that chalk, turned it into that beautiful garden, didn't he? Yeah. And there is also going round, I expect it's in the museum, is a film of all this, what he did, Mr. Stern, and it's a wonderful film. It's a pity they don't show it more often, really.
Oh, I don't know if we know about that. That sounds interesting.
Oh yes, it's wonderful.
On a Sunday, we used to go for a Sunday walk a long way right up to the Downs.
The whole family?
Yes, or not always my mother, but my father, my sister and I.
Oh.
A lot of the places in Durrington were just footpaths and nurseries. There were lots and lots of nurseries in Durrington at the foot of there. I can remember a lot of greenhouses and nurseries, and I know a lot of the time we could walk on footpaths, you know, there weren't roads.
Where did you end up?
Sometimes went to Cissbury or Highdown, or I don't know if we walked as far as High Somerton. We certainly used to go to High Somerton, but I've got a feeling that might have been on the bus.
You remember Sir Frederick Stern and...
By sight.
Yes.
I didn't know them. I knew him by sight, and I have spoken to Lady Stern. You know, just pass the time of day and say good morning, good afternoon. Very, very nice, sociable lady she was. Very pleasant. Everybody liked her.
And you remember her shopping in Goring?
Yes, a shop called Bond and Allen's, which was a ladies' outfitters. My mother worked there, and I know she was a customer there, a regular customer. She probably had an account there, because ladies in those days had accounts. Used to go and buy their autumn clothes and their spring clothes. And
Going back to Lady Stern, did she cut a smart, elegant figure?
I would say a good suit and a very nice scarf, and probably flat shoes. Tall lady. She seemed to be tall and slim, and he was very tall, I think. Don't know so much about him. Didn't see him around so often, but I think he was attending to his estate, probably. But she certainly did her shopping here in the local shops.
And did you ever visit?
Yes, well, I think they were. It must have been Easter time, probably, that they opened for Easter Sunday. I think they had special days when they opened. I think the garden's very nice. I think it's well looked after. Yes, you could walk along the still footpaths, by Goring Station. And I can remember when it had the old gates, and the man in the box used to open and shut the gates. And there's footpaths all going across there, and there still are some that run out to Ferring and to the Bull and out there.
And then when you got to the Little Hampton Road?
Cross the road and walk up the drive.
So you wouldn't really want to do that today, would you? So,
I couldn't.
No.
I would like to.
But I'm thinking from the
No,
amount of
not
traffic.
crossing the road, no. Traffic was no problem because there weren't the cars around. I mean, cars were a luxury when I was young, or even in the 50s.
My grandfather, who was Jesse Reed, his family came from Wiltshire, and he was the eldest of 12 children and was kicked out at the age of 12, made his way to London, and somehow, I don't know how, became employed by Colonel and Mrs. Stern, and he became Colonel Stern's Batman. And the Sterns had bought Highdown as their weekend and holiday retreat. And they used to come down on the train with the staff, go up to Highdown and stay for however long they wished, and then back on the train up to London. But a few years later, when Colonel Stern was really interested in developing the chalk pit into the garden, they kept some staff permanently at Highdown because they were becoming more and more often. And both my father and his sister were born at Highdown in what was their bedroom at the time, but later became the kitchen. Dad trained at Wisley. He was a student there for 3 years, and 39 he was fully qualified, but of course war broke out, the Second World War. After the war I was born, and Dad was demobbed, and in those days they only had their suit, and of course he needed a job. And Colonel Stern, somehow they contacted him, and he required a head gardener at Highdown. Dad was offered the position by Colonel Stern, so we all moved up to Highdown in the cottage to live, which is now where the hotel is up there. And it was a very old cottage. Colonel Stern had had a bathroom put in upstairs because before that it had been the outside loo only and the tin bath in front of the fire. I was only introduced to Colonel and Mrs. Stern once, and I had to be taken to the library in my best dress. I can even remember now, so I couldn't have been very old, I was probably only about 4 or 5, but I can remember standing thinking I better not say anything, these important people. But that was the only time I personally met them. Colonel Stern, was so much into plants. He and my father got on very well because obviously of Dad's background as well. And Dad developed a lot of the garden up there under Colonel Stern's supervision, because the great big hellebore bank which leads off of the downpool fish pond and goes southwards, Dad planted the whole of that area up while he was there and designed it as well. And the first fish pond on the left with the sort of
the cave behind
that
it.
was the pigsty years ago. And then you walk down to the main pond, and above that, going up loads of stairs, was a great big summer house, wooden summer house, which the Sterns had built for them for afternoon tea. And of course, Barnes the butler absolutely hated it, because he had to go from the kitchen in the main house with a silver tray, with a silver teapot and everything on it, and march and climb these stairs all the way up to the summer house. And I think he got a few words about the fact that the tea was a bit cold, but there's nothing that could have been done about that. He had a very dry sense of humour. He used to go and bow and scrape to Colonel and Mrs. Stern, then come out the kitchen and say silly old sods and all the rest of it. He was brilliant. And he always wore, for the evening meal, even if they were just the two of them dining, he always wore his proper black trousers and the waistcoat and the coat, and he had his pantry to clean all the silver and everything. And he was really nice. And Daisy, the lady's maid who looked after Lady Stern, was a spinster lady with dark hair drawn back in a bun, very quiet, had been her lady's maid for years. And Nan was the one who got her out and took her on, they used to go on holiday together. And Nan's greatest thing she wished to do was to go on holiday to Vienna in Austria, and the pair of them made it one year, and that to them was the most marvellous thing they could have done. Because I was growing up there, it was a fabulous time of freedom and joy, because when the Sterns weren't there, I used to follow Dad round the garden. I don't think I was much help. He always told me I used to hide all his tools and all the rest of it. When I first went up there, of course, the gate was there at the bottom of the hill, and you had to wait for one of them to come out the cottage to open the gate. But that soon disappeared, and the bus still came along the one road that was there. It wasn't dual carriageway or anything like that. The bus still came along at the bottom to take us into Ferring village. But it was very rural then. I mean, from the front of Highdown House, you could see the sea. Those trees hadn't grown up, and you had the most lovely vista right down to the sea.
So how long was he head gardener for?
Only from 1946 to 1951. And John Bassindale, who later became the head gardener, was Dad's deputy until Dad went to the Worthing Corporation as park superintendent. Dad did go up there by himself occasionally to see Sir Frederick. I don't think it was ever quite the same. From what I heard Dad say, Sir Frederick giving him the job after the war, he sort of looked on as then he would be there forevermore because I've given you the job.
And do you remember John Bassindale?
Yes, I do, because he was under Dad, but
yeah.
then of course he became the head gardener.
And remained so until he died.
Yes, I know, long time, yeah.
Your father was working here for James Buckham, was he?
Yes, he started under him, yes. He must have done because he came in I was born in 47, March, and they came a few months later when he started working here. But we started off living at the cottage at the bottom of the driveway with no electric and no gas.
Or one of the lodge houses?
Yes, the East Lodge.
Oh,
yes,
right, okay.
Yes. And my mother cooked on a range then.
And the road down there was
A lane.
carriageway?
A lane, yes.
Yes.
The driveway went into the road, but in the middle was an elm tree. So it forked into two parts, and the middle of the driveway was an elm tree.
Oh. And so did that go when they dual carriageway did?
Yes.
Which
yeah.
I'm thinking was about 1968,
Can't
like
remember
that.
exactly when it was. I don't remember, but yes, it probably was about then.
And that must have changed the whole atmosphere.
Yes, and it opened up the driveway because it was just these two single track into the and there was a gate on the driveway, although it never got closed. They didn't close the gate, but it was there. Moved from the lodge house to the cottage, which is now the hotel. Before that was a hotel, that was a cottage. There was a dairy underneath it and two coaching houses where the cars were kept.
So is that the chauffeur you were referring to?
Yes, yeah. And he had a house in in Goring. The Stearns bought a house for him in Goring.
They bought him a house?
Yes. And the butler, George Barnes at that time, years ago, had a house in Ferring. There was a house there that they had. Although he lived in most of the time, but there was a house there that the family lived in.
And did they have other servants?
When I was young, they had a cook, who was Mrs. Reed, and there was a housekeeper, but I can't remember her name. The lady who was the cook and the housekeepers and that had all retired, and they wanted a living couple to look after them, so they needed some accommodation. So the cottage that we were in was their accommodation, and this was built for my father. A few years ago I met somebody in the garden who was, I suppose I overheard the conversation, and she was talking about coming up here to play with somebody, which was me.
Right.
And I heard her speaking, and I said, "Excuse me, but I'm the person you're talking about." "Oh my God!" And we then remembered that we knew each other, and she had come up here to play and to have tea and things like that, and birthday parties, of course.
Sir Frederick and Lady Sybil, what do you remember of them? Let's start with Sir Frederick.
He was just somebody that was always there. You have to remember I had a different relationship with them to my parents because I didn't work for them. When you work for somebody, it's a different relationship, isn't it? And they weren't used to children, either of them, so it was always... They treated you as an adult, although you weren't an adult, if you understand what I mean.
Because they didn't have any experience of how to deal.
They had no experience of how to deal with children at all, no.
Oh, did you speak to them? Have you any
Oh
particular
yes,
memories?
yeah, not particular, not so much of him, more of her. He was much more of a more aloof sort of figure, really. But I had much more contact with her over the years. I used to go around the garden with her, collecting flowers for the house, with a flat flower basket. And then we'd go into the cubby hole under the stairs, the back stairs that aren't there anymore, and arrange the flowers and put them around the house. He introduced me to daffodils when I was little and told me all about them and explained them and showed me what you did with them, because in those days they dug up all the bulbs every year and dried them and then put them all back in the garden again the following spring.
And that wouldn't happen now?
Does it? Does it? No.
So what was the thinking behind that then?
Well, he used to sell the bulbs. He used to send them all over the world because he reared them here and produced them himself, propagated them himself, and then as they sort of materialised and evolved, he used to sell them on.
And what do you remember about your father's role here as head gardener? What was his? Did he have a daily routine?
Well, he was always here. He worked in his workplace, didn't he? And he lived in his workplace. His workplace was where he was, so he was never away from it, really. He was never not working, really. The garden was his life. So everything he did revolved around the garden. He was a Yorkshireman from North Yorkshire near Whitby. And his background was steelworks, and he had a background in farming as well, so he'd done a variety of things. But then the Second World War came, didn't it? And he left Yorkshire, which he probably never would have done if it hadn't been for the war. He then met my mother in Esher and never went back to Yorkshire, really. But having come down here and then getting involved, or I suppose seeing the option of a job with a house, because the house went with the job.
So was he living in this part of the world when he saw the job advertised? Or?
Well, I was born in Angmering at my grandfather's house, and they were living there at the time when he came out of the army. They were actually living there with my grandparents.
Do you think he envisaged that he'd be here so long?
I'm sure he didn't, no. I'm sure he didn't. It just evolved as time went on, didn't you know, and the Stearns gave him more responsibility, obviously, as time went on, and they worked together. He and Sir Frederick worked quite closely together.
So I'm thinking he must have had a good working relationship.
Yes.
Otherwise,
he
he wouldn't have stayed, would he?
No. They used to argue. They did. They used to argue about what they should do and where they should put things. By then, Sir Frederick was getting older. Obviously, arthritis got the better of him eventually. But he was always around the gardens. And he actually worked in the gardens. I mean, he would get his hands dirty. He wasn't just a figurehead or anything. He would work with the gardeners. Everything was left to run into everything else. He didn't cut things back like people do now. He let everything grow.
So it was a bit more wild.
It was wilder, definitely wilder, because that's how he liked it. He liked to see things grow into other things.
And were the pathways laid out as they are now?
No, they were. The beds were different. The pathways were much narrower, and the borders much bigger and different shapes. And originally, where the garden is, at the bottom of the garden, was a huge vegetable patch, massive vegetable garden. So we were almost completely self-sufficient, really.
How did she cope after he died? Did she just continue, or did her interest maintain?
Yes, she just continued with the project, because it had been there, as you said earlier, it had been their project, hadn't it? So she just continued with what they'd been doing.
And do you remember the East End children?
Yes. Yes. The camp.
Well, they were in tents, were they?
They were in bell tents, old army bell tents.
And where were they put up?
Where?
Yes.
If you go out of the back of the garden to where the miller's tomb is, behind that there's a field, which also belonged to Sir Frederick, and they were put up there. And they were Jewish, obviously, so on a Friday night we used to get invited over. They had a huge marquee where everybody was invited to supper before the Sabbath. But I remember that vividly, walking across the downs in the middle of the night after the supper. I lived here till I was 19 when I got married. I lived here again when my children were young, in the cottage that we used to live in, where the hotel is now. While we were waiting for our house to be ready down in Goring, the first house we bought, Lady Stern allowed us to live in the cottage there. So I actually came back with my own family and lived in the cottage as it was then. And she used to come around and have tea with me.
That's nice.
Yes. With the children.
What sort of lady was she? Because looking at the photographs of her, was she a strong, strident person, or was she reserved?
She was very smart. But yes, she was quite a strong character, really. But she had no idea how to deal with children. She used to expect my children to shake hands if they stood in front of her. So I used to have to push their arm to remind them to put their hand up to shake hands with her.
And they were very small children, I guess.
Well, she knew them from when they were born, right the way, as she did me, right the way through their early lives, really. But she never understood children. And then, oddly, latterly, I'm a hairdresser, and I used to work at a hairdresser's in Goring, off the seafront there, and she used to come and have her hair done there.
How did your father find the change from the Sterns owning and running the garden to the council taking over?
I think he found it quite hard to start with, because he'd only ever worked latterly in those years for Sir Frederick, so he found it quite hard, I think, in the beginning. Obviously they just decided to keep things as they were, and they just transferred it all over, because Lady Stern was still alive then. It happened after he died, but before she died, obviously. Well, as far as she was concerned, it was still hers, wasn't it?
So she carried on the garden.
Oh, absolutely, yes. She would go out there and do whatever she wanted to do. It was still her garden, wasn't it? They used to open the gardens, but only 2 or 3 times a year. He didn't like people tramping around his gardens.
You can understand that.
Yes. But after the council took over, then it started to be open on a more regular basis. I think they started during the week, and then sort of, if it was open at the weekends, he was here as well. So he was always here.
So did that increase his workload?
To a certain extent, I suppose, yes, but it wouldn't have mattered to him because that was all part of what he did, wasn't it? And he would have been quite happy to do that because he was always pleased to talk to people in the gardens and tell them about it and tell them about the plants. Well, and also he had students from Kew come to be at the garden under him, and Chris, who was here as head gardener, also knew him and had worked with him before he ever came here. So yes, he loved anybody who liked his garden because he always thought of it as his garden. In those days, if you had a tied house and it was an estate, a private estate, my father worked in the garden, but she was expected to work in the house, so, which is what she did.
And what did she do?
Well, initially she just cleaned in there, but eventually she looked after Lady Stern. I mean, Lady Stern was a lady. She was a debutante in the days when being a debutante meant something. Yes, it all got a bit sad by the end, I'm afraid. That's why it needed a lot of repair, and where the problems came when the council took it over.
Florence Holden. Do you remember her?
Yes, I do. Yes. She lived in the cottage, the opposite cottage to the one we started off in. And her family had worked here for years. Her father had worked here. I'm not sure he actually worked in the garden or whether he worked in the farm, but they worked around this area for a long time. And she also had family in Ferring who were well known in Ferring. And sure it was her brother or her nephew or somebody used to do all the odd jobs up here.
But she was a gardener?
She was a gardener, yes. Auntie Flo. And she was always around. She was just one of those people that I always remember.
I had a couple of jobs that I didn't like. I thought I'd be working in an office, didn't know where I wanted to go, and then saw advertised in the Herald. It was for apprentice for the Parks Department. Well, give it a go, and horticulture. So then Parks Manager Mr. Reed interviewed me and said, yeah, you can start on Monday. So it's quite an easy interview. So as an apprentice, so a lot of the men on the Parks Department were ex-nurserymen, tomato, cucumber growers and all that, and they used to tell you tales of the old days where the old nurseries were. They've all gone. But, they used to push the trolleys of tomatoes down to the station to get up to Covent Garden in the morning first thing. Our first recollection of actual Highdown was, I think, about 1965, when we had a trip from the college, took us up here to Highdown to be shown round. And that was the first time, the only time I ever saw Sir Frederick Stern, because he came to the very back of the house there and he waved to us. He had a walking stick and he waved to us. But I didn't obviously speak to him, and Lady Stern showed us round. But little did I know that I'd end up, from 1976, being head gardener up here. When I finished my apprenticeship, went to Kew for about 3.5 years, and I came back and I worked here for about 3 months, and Lady Stern was still here. So I did see her quite a few times, and she was a very upright lady, and she had a walking stick and a little dog. And she used to point at things and say, well, that was so-and-so and that was so-and-so. But she was living in the garden. By that time, Sir Frederick had left the gardens to the Borough Council, but she was living in the house and she was allowed to live there, for the rest of her days, obviously, But she looked at it as her garden, which it was, really. Their garden, they built it from nothing, so... I've been unkind to the Borough Council. It was a bit difficult for them to inherit a garden like this when didn't really know what to do with it, in a way.
I suppose it helped that John Bassindale carried on.
Oh yeah,
That was the continuity.
Yeah.
And how did he find the change?
To be honest, I don't think he liked it very much. I don't think it's a big difference working for somebody like Frederick Stern and working for the borough council or corporation as it was. His knowledge was it was like Fred Stone's knowledge. You know, the plants and that was huge. Really, he had notes.
What were the challenges that the garden faced in the early 70s? Or did really Bassindale just continue exactly as
It
he
tried
had?
to continue, I think, as it was, really, but things would get harder and harder when the staff get less and less. Flo Holden, who used to live in the cottage
yes.
at the bottom of the drive there, I worked with her.
And what do you remember of her?
She could work bending over, weeding, without kneeling down or anything for hours. Well, I wasn't here that long with John, actually, because opportunity came. I wanted to get into the borough council nurseries, so I thought I would end up nursery manager.
What brought you back here then?
Well, the untimely death of John.
Oh, I see, yes.
Suddenly he passed away. I said to Ron Reed, I said, I'd be interested in giving that a go at Highdown, And he said yes. So I come up here in the April after John's death. So, but the place was so dry. It had dried out in '76. The grass had all gone, and you never thought it'd ever come back. But it's amazing how it does recover. Although I had Stern's card index records, which had a lot of information, it didn't tell you what anything was. No locations. So, which makes it very difficult to pinpoint what things are, where they are, But I did have a chalk card in his book, so that gave me a good start. And I worked from there, really, and learnt as I went along. I had to learn very quickly. It's a constant battle to keep the plants going, really, the collection going as such, simply because it's not a museum. I think if you're going to be a gardener, you've got to be a bit of an optimist, because you wouldn't bother otherwise. You just say, oh, it's all done for. Well, you can't really, because it's your job, isn't it? You think, well, this is what's so special about the gardens here. It's on solid chalk, and there aren't any others. The only other one I can think of is Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, which is on a chalky soil. But even though it's not quite the same as on the South Downs here, it's the only garden of size. But this is quite a large garden in comparison,
So, it is sort of unique then.
It is unique, yes. So that's why it's special.